For the fourth episode of Let Us Disagree with Jimmy Morrison, we have our panel from the premiere of the fall of 2008 at Freedom Fest and the Anthem Film Festival in Palm Springs, California. We also received an award for independent filmmaking, so I included my remarks from that. If you missed our first 3 episodes, we had Jim Rogers, who's one of the best investors of the 20th century. But what we talked to him about was his life as an explorer, where he drove a motorcycle across the Sahara, Siberia, China, the whole world. And then we also have Ron Paul on our second episode, who everybody knows. And Peter Schiff is also on our third episode, so you can get to know him there, but he's also on our panel today. So on our panel we have Mark Skousen as the moderator, and Peter Schiff is joined by Steve Forbes and John Fund and myself.
I hope some of you guys saw the film The Fall of 2008. It's the second film in a trilogy of economics documentaries, but it's a passion project that goes back pretty far. I actually started shooting the interviews in 2011. I had traveled over 48,000 miles shooting interviews with people like Ron Paul and Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff and Doug Casey and Jim Grant and David Stockman and a lot of other people, you know, there were a lot of them, but I didn't even know about the Federal Reserve when I started this project. I just set out to interview people that predicted the housing crash so that I wouldn't get caught up in it the next time. So it's been quite a journey. The IRS has come after me 2 times. They fined me $14,000, and thankfully I was able to win those appeals, but they're reviewing my tax return for the last 4 months for a 3rd time now, so we'll see how that goes. I've had a lot of challenges with this project. I essentially went bankrupt in 2015 trying to do it. Finally premiered the first film at Anthem, thank you Joanne, in 2018 and released it in 2019, just in time to go on tour when COVID hit. So if that wasn't enough, Facebook actually made it so you could not post links to our website, letusdisagree.com, when the first film came out. So we've had a lot of challenges. I can't ask everybody to believe in me every second, because I certainly have had my times where I haven't believed in this project. But we persevered and we got it done. And I just want to close by saying that it's easy to think it's impossible to take on these impossible giants like the Federal Reserve, the Department of the Treasury, and the IRS. But thanks to Lynn Ulbricht, we all can see that sometimes the person does get freed, and it's a moment that we can celebrate her and everything that happened with Ross. That it's sometimes the fight as a libertarian is depressing, but we gotta win, so let's celebrate it. Thank you guys.
Jimmy, I have a quick question. How do you find all those clips?
It took a long time, but Pete Holmes, the comedian, once said that everybody's a genius, it's just some people write things down. And so it's been a lot of years of anytime I see something that's a topic of a film that I want to make at some point, I kind of make a note of it.
That's great. Does anyone else have a quick question about the movie before we move into the financial? Does anyone have a question about the movie itself?
The movie clips are all fair use, yeah.
Yes.
How does they get copyright permission to use all those?
How do you get the copyright permission to use the clips?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they have what's called fair use, where essentially if you're using it to make a political point and combining it with other footage, then they allow you to not pay for that in the United States. So it's kind of a fine line that there's not specific wording exactly of what's fair use and what's not. So it does open you up to getting sued. But I believe that I did not break any laws.
Because he doesn't believe in laws in the first place. The last time Jimmy had a movie at our festival, same thing happened, standing room only, and we opened the doors and people actually had seats sitting outside the door for the entire panel. So Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
So when I think of the next crisis and crisis investing, it does remind me of a person who was pretty regular at Freedom Fest, Doug Casey. How many remember Doug Casey? We'd often call him Crazy Doug Casey. He was often predicting rather doomsday scenarios, and but he was definitely a crisis-oriented type of person. But we have the next best thing, Peter Schiff, right? And so let's talk about the next financial crisis, because Jimmy's film has talked about a number of causes. There's not always one cause of a crisis, is there? We've had the inflation crisis of the 1970s, the energy crisis, right? And in the 1980s, we had the stock market crash of 1987, which was a speculative crisis. In the 1990s and into the 2000, we had the dot-com crisis, which created quite difficulties. And we also had an Asian crisis with currency, a currency crisis. And then in 2008, we had a real estate crisis. And in 2020, we had a pandemic crisis. And now we're looking into the future, and we want to know what is going to be. Is there going to be another crisis? Is the most recent crisis the last, or will there be another one? And then the second question is, what could cause that crisis? So who would like to venture a guess as to whether we are going to have another crisis, and what will be the cause?
Well, I'll be very brief before Peter takes over. And he will. It's a crisis of confidence. If you do not have confidence in the fiat money system, if you do not have confidence in our superior overlords in Washington, if you do not have confidence in the stability of the banking or financial system, lack of confidence will lead to a crisis. And government and its minions and the parastatals that are attached to government eventually will lead to a loss of confidence. I do know that at some point, if we do not learn from the error of our ways, there will be a debt crisis, and that will manifest itself in a crisis of confidence. I'm not here to predict that. I'm here to say, if we don't do something, it's inevitable.
Okay, but you're not giving a date. But you think the debt will be the source, could be the source of the next crisis?
No, not the next. No. We could have other crises, but at the current rate of deterioration, and the fact that the United States' economic position vis-a-vis the rest of the world is shrinking, there will be a debt crisis if nothing happens. It may not be the next one, but it is inevitable at the current projections.
So while John was speaking, we have our favorite professor of finance, is what I want to call Mr. Steve Forbes. Mr. Forbes, have you made a decision on who's going to win in the pitch tank?
The answer is yes, which is why I was late. That's my excuse. But is this on?
No.
It didn't look on, but I couldn't turn it on. Yeah, that's
Yeah, and this I don't think we can move. We might have to share one. I should say, Mr. Forbes, that my initial.
But anyway,
okay, go ahead.
You're not going to get an answer unless I'm recording.
Well, it sounds like it's on.
Now it's on, I believe.
Right. Does it work?
Yes, good. There we go. All right.
Even if you're not writing about the economy, we'll have you hire as an electrician.
While you were coming in, I asked two questions. One is, will we have another crisis? Is the most recent one the last, or will there be another one? And what will be the cause? In the past, it's been inflation, speculation, the dot-com boom, the real estate market, the pandemic. Maybe this year, maybe this time it'll be the tariffs. What do you think?
To the question, will there be a crisis? The answer is yes. What it is, if we knew, we'd all be having it reflected in the marketplace, in
the financial markets. But crisis is going to come on inflation. You see that in the gold price, that in 12 or a month or so, that you're going to get monetary inflation. Just as in 2019, when the gold price went from 1,200 to almost 2,000, just before COVID hit. So you had both supply chain shocks, government spending shocks, and the Federal Reserve undermining the integrity of the dollar. In the last 2 years, the gold price has gone from 1,800 to over 3,300. So there's going to be a crisis in the future. The Federal Reserve does not understand inflation. So there will be a financial crisis because the Federal Reserve's model is basically wrong. And it's amazing the political class hasn't glommed onto it. There's going to be a foreign policy crisis, not just what is going on in the Middle East, but with Ukraine, and which Xi Jinping is looking at to see if the West has any backbone anymore. And also Xi Jinping, who's in a very weakened position in China. When a dictator for life is in a weak position, they oftentimes resort to a foreign crisis or a nationalist whip-up to try to shore up the regime. So in Taiwan, it could be, what if they seize one of the islands around Taiwan? What if they declare a 24-hour boycott of Taiwan, or 12 hours, just to establish that China's the dominant power? And the thing in that part of the world is all those countries there are very dependent on Chinese trade. So they ask the U.S., don't ask us to choose between one or the other, but what they want is a strong U.S. presence to counter that. And you see that in the case of Vietnam. We had a movie earlier on Vietnam. They desperately want a strong U.S. presence there. They've been living next to China forever, and they have no illusions about what would happen if they didn't have a counterweight of the United States there. So I think Xi Jinping is going to test us. I think we're going to get other tests as well. So yes, there'll be a crisis. There'll be plenty for us to write about.
So we have two examples of possible crises. One is the deficit debt crisis that John mentioned, and the other one is the possibility of war that could spread beyond the Middle East, beyond Ukraine, and move over to Asia, and maybe be another world war. So, Peter, do you have a perspective? Yeah. Do you have any other?
I will give you the definitive answer on this, and I'm speaking on behalf of Doug Casey as well. But so I don't think it's another crisis. I think it's all part of the same crisis, and it all has one cause, and I would pin that on the Federal Reserve. But the problem is that
move it further away.
The Federal Reserve has held interest rates artificially low for too long, and by doing that, it has created the deficit problem. The national debt and the large annual budget deficits, the enormous trade deficits are a consequence of artificially low interest rates that discourage us from saving. And because we don't save, we don't make the capital investments necessary to produce, and instead we import what we can't produce. The government is allowed to live beyond its means. Asset prices are overpriced as a reflection of the artificially low interest rates. And every once in a while, it blows up. The market tries to correct the distortions that the Fed created. You saw that when the dot-com bubble that the Fed inflated popped. You saw that when the housing bubble that the Fed inflated popped. But every time one of the Fed's bubbles pops, rather than allowing the free market to fix what the Fed broke, forcing fiscal responsibility on Washington, the Fed enables it by more of the same policy that created the underlying problem. Except like any kind of drug addiction, every time we go back to the cheap money well, we need more and more. Right? We need more QE. We need even lower interest rates. We need to print even more money. And the way the Fed is able to do this, the way they bailed us out of the mortgage crisis, was by substituting its own credit for the bad credit in the mortgage market. But this next leg of this same crisis, which will probably be the final leg, is going to be a US dollar and a sovereign debt crisis. So it's not just that the world loses confidence in the ability of an over-leveraged homeowner to repay his subprime mortgage. It's going to be a loss of confidence in the U.S. government's ability to repay its debt. Not necessarily that we'll default, although I'm not going to take that off the table, but the fact that we won't default, we'll just print. And it's a loss of confidence in the dollar that ultimately triggers a loss of confidence in the treasury market, which are basically IOUs for dollars. So if you don't have confidence in the future value of the dollar, you don't have confidence in treasuries, and you get a run on treasuries in the dollar, and that really pricks this bubble. And it's the one crisis that the Fed can't bail us out of, because the Fed is powerless. If the loss of confidence is in the dollar and treasuries, there are no bailouts. There's just consequences that we've been delaying for decades now, as we've been able to kick that can down the road. But I think, as Steve Forbes said, $3,450 gold, the fact that the last time the Fed cut rates, bond yields rose, the fact that bond yields rose again today, even though there's tension in the Middle East, the dollar treasuries have lost their safe haven status. That's obvious. Foreign central banks are moving into gold and out of dollars. That trend is going to accelerate over the next several years, and I think ultimately culminate in a financial crisis that will make 2008 look like a Sunday school picnic.
Okay, well, we've gotten perspective here. Now let's go to Jimmy. Jimmy, you've done this film, and you've covered all these crises. You've updated your film through the financial crisis, the most recent one, and COVID and so forth. Do you see any relevance? We've had 3 examples: the debt, a dollar crisis, a war. Those are 3 new ones for you. So what's your choice? What's your pick?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So for those of you guys that don't know, this was the second film in a trilogy. So the first film gets into the causes of the housing bubble and gets into the history of the Great Depression and going off the gold standard, stuff like that. What we just watched was obviously the responses to the housing crash. And then the third film is the bigger bubble that kind of brings it more up to date and gets into some of those longer term trends. And I think what Peter just mentioned is really important, is that recently when we saw trouble in the stock market, people weren't running into US Treasuries like they have. And so that's kind of been the big trend over these last 40, 50 years in these crashes that I've been studying and that people see in the films, is that the United States has been able to get away with this bubble economy because we're the world reserve currency and because everybody views the dollar as the safe haven. And so what's really scary is it doesn't seem like interest rates are reacting that way anymore. And if the Fed really has lost control, then I think the inflation we've seen and the issues we've seen are really nothing compared to what's to come.
So John, you've had real-world experience with crisis, and let's talk specifically about the Canadian crisis that you predicted. You wrote a famous Wall Street Journal article, I believe in 1994, called 95, called the Canadian peso. And tell us how that was resolved, because they resolved their debt crisis, at least for a while. And tell us that story, because this is really relevant to this whole situation.
Well, Canada, starting with the first Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, had mismanaged itself for, at that point, almost 20 years. All of the things that you can imagine: debt, spending, boondoggle projects. And of course, at the time, Canada had less than 30 million people, and it was in the shadow of the United States. So it was not a major world financial player, but it was certainly influenced by events in the United States, and we were often misgoverned during that same period, at least during the 70s. While Ronald Reagan was restoring confidence in the American economy, and the dollar was going through an historic increase, the Canadian loonie was collapsing, debt was being piled up, not just by the federal government, but by the provinces. Incredible mismanagement in the quasi-public corporations that dominate much of the Canadian economy. The banking system in Canada is highly centralized. There are only 4 or 5 major banks, so there was no danger of a bank run, and the Bank of Canada could, at least as long as the Fed was carrying its interest policy could continue for a while. But it was a path that was unsustainable, just as I mentioned in my first remarks. And the government in the mid-1990s was run by Prime Minister Chrétien. We called him Cretin behind his back. And I went to a conference in Toronto sponsored by the Fraser Institute, which is the leading free market think tank in Canada, representing the Wall Street Journal at the time. And I gave a speech that warned about all of these things, but it was in measured terms, as someone from an August paper like the Wall Street Journal would use. And the director of the conference in the Fraser Institute, Mike Walker, came up to me and said, "John, you've done a horrible job." And I said, "Well, I had all the facts and figures. I borrowed from Fraser Institute papers. How could I have done a horrible job?" And he said, "Your job was to scare the blank out of this audience, and you have failed completely." And I said, "Well, I'm just a lowly journalist, not an economist." And he said, that's precisely why we needed you, because you represent common sense. And you also could speak plainly." So I went back to the journal offices in New York, and I met with Bob Bartley, who was the editor at the time, and said, our Canadian friends who've written for us for years say we need to scare the blank out of them. And here are the numbers. And Bob said, "Well, let's bring out our howitzers. We have enough muzzle velocity, and let's see what happens." So I wrote the Northern Peso, not the Canadian peso, it was called the Northern Peso, and we basically said Canada was the next Mexico. Well, that had a reaction. The phone started ringing. I think the first day the Canadian loonie lost 3.5 cents on the first day. And all of the headlines were, the Wall Street Journal has written off Canada. Mm-hmm. And I think I did more TV interviews and radio interviews that day than any single day in my career. And the Canadians knew they had a problem, but the Canadian journalists are a sorry lot. I mean, look, at their best, the Canadians are polite and well-mannered and dutiful, and they don't have sharp elbows. That's at Canada at its best. At its worst, Canada is the single repository of more passive-aggressive people than any country I've ever met. I think I found a Canadian who'll agree with me, right? Passive-aggressive behavior. They will pretend to be nice to you, and they'll snipe at you behind your back. So I became the face of the ugly American in Canada. And they couldn't get enough of me. They had me on there, and I was their official piñata. And I said, "It's appropriate that I'm a piñata since I've said you're the next Mexico." And they just had politician after politician come on and berate me and attack me and everything. And I quickly rose to the occasion. I'm sorry. I quickly rose to the occasion. It was so much fun. Sorry. Yeah. No, the Canadians. They're still mad. And by the way,
this has a good ending, John.
Yes, it does. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Okay. So I would say things like, well, you can fight everything, but you can't fight the laws of economics. So anyway, they immediately had an emergency meeting of the Canadian cabinet. The finance minister, who actually was very much in favor of reform, Paul Martin, went to the prime minister and said, "We've got to change. The markets are not going to sustain this. The moment has come." And Chrétien went along with it, but first he was going to give a speech to the Economic Club of New York, and to raise confidence. This is a previously scheduled speech, raise confidence in the economy. So of course I showed up and sat in the audience, and he proceeded to attack me personally, my newspaper secondly, and the United States of America third. So as soon as he finished, I called my own news conference and proceeded to lay out the facts. He called his news conference. I think he had 3 reporters there, and I had 30. It was the most heady experience of my life. Anyway, to cut the long story short, Canada did change, and it had for the next 20 years until the next Trudeau came into office, Justin Trudeau. It was a leader in sound fiscal management. I still get called upon to talk about Canada. The only side note I'll end with this is, I was told by a friend of mine who happened to be sitting in a Maple Leaf airline lounge in Toronto that the Attorney General of Canada, Herbert Gray, had sat next to him with his aide, and they were going over some files. It turned out they were security files from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the subject of them was me. They were convinced I was a front for currency speculators, trying to drive down the value of the Canadian dollar. And they went through the whole file, saying things about my life, and my friend carefully took notes. So by chance, a week later, I was in Toronto for a speech to attack Chrétien and the Canadian government. Lo and behold, in the same conference center, there was a lawyers' conference, and the Attorney General of Canada, Herb Gray, was there. So this was fun. So I went up to him. You know, he only had one security guy hanging in the background. It was very informal. And I said, Mr. Attorney General, I have to speak with you. So we went into a side conference room, and I proceeded to have the fun of my life. I proceeded to ream him out. I said, you think you have an intelligence service? You have nothing on the Wall Street Journal. Let me tell you what I have learned, what you said in the Maple Leaf. And I just went, he must have thought that I had his entire life microphone. Anyway, at the end I said, and if you misbehave and you put any more surveillance on me, and you have any aspersions on my character, I will destroy your political career, and I will enjoy it. And the fellow literally, his face melted. His face melted. He literally looked as if the end of the world had come. And I never had such fun, and every time I'm up in Canada, it seems every border guard is very friendly to me.
Well, the real lesson here is never get on John Funn's bad side.
I practice passive-aggressive behavior too.
Just to expand a little bit on what John said, Canada had this terrible crisis and they resolved it two ways. One is they worked together, the two political parties, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party actually worked together because there was a crisis that they had to resolve. And they cut the budget, they laid off federal workers, they balanced the budget within a couple of years. They engaged in a supply side tax cut policy. They strengthened the Canadian dollar. It was no longer the peso. Of course, that's all changed. But for a good 20 years, like you said, they did a tremendous job. So let us not be pessimistic as Peter is, that it's all going to hell in a handbasket. It's the worst ever. We can never get out of that. And to that, we don't have Art Laffer here to argue with Peter on this, but Mr. Forbes, can you be a little bit more optimistic? Can we get out of the debt crisis? Is that possible?
You missed your chance when you didn't elect me president.
So we are in big trouble, is what you're saying. Okay.
Remember what Mayor Koch said after he lost his third term as mayor in New York City. They said, Mayor Koch, you've been defeated, you're going to leave office. What is your message to the voters of New York? And Koch looked at the camera and he pointed his finger at the audience and he said, the voters have spoken. They have rendered their decision, and now they must be punished.
The point you made, Mark, when you talked about the Canadians didn't do anything until there was a crisis.
Yeah, right.
That's going to be the same thing here.
Sure.
We're not going to do anything, except we are going to have a much bigger crisis than Canada because we were able to avoid the crisis for so long because we had the reserve currency and the Canadians did not. And so the crisis that's going to finally force U.S. politicians to cut government spending, which would include entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense. And we're not going to do that until they can't play this game anymore. So it has to be a real dollar and sovereign debt crisis to finally break that cycle. Because as long as we can kick the can down the road, we'll do it. And so things have to get really, really bad. Like, you know, people were saying, oh, maybe Donald Trump was going to be like Milei in Argentina. Things had gotten really bad in Argentina before a guy like Milei could get elected with the support of the people and do the right thing. And so Donald Trump can't come close to Milei because America never got to the point of Argentina. The good news is we're going to get there. If you want to call it good
So
news.
I want Mr. Forbes to give us some hope here. Is that possible?
The answer is actually yes. And in terms of the entitlements, let's start with the biggies, Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is the most expensive health insurance program in the world, and probably the worst run in the world, worst outcomes in the world for the money that's laid out. But I think what you're going to see happen, you're already starting to see it happen in the private sector. I'm surprised it hasn't happened faster, but it's going to happen. Almost every employer now has high deductible insurance policies instead of the traditional dollar for dollar coverage. People are now paying more out of pocket than they've ever done before. What is starting to create is a true consumer market in healthcare. When you go somewhere now, more and more you want to know what is it going to cost because you're starting to pay it. And what that is going to bring about is a consumer market in healthcare, and over time that's going to turn healthcare from a hopeless drain to dynamism. There's good stuff coming along in healthcare, and when you get a real consumer market, that's going to mean more healthcare at less cost. That sounds right now. If you ever say we need to save money in healthcare, everyone assumes you're taking something away. But with real true consumerism, that means more for less. And one example of it is the Surgery Center of Oklahoma, which is all cash. They take no insurance, and you pay in advance. They quote your price at the beginning. You can go online and see what something costs. If it's more expensive, they eat the cost. And their costs, and they have all board certified surgeons, so their outcomes are as good as, or better than the traditional hospitals, and their costs are about 30% of a typical hospital for a procedure. That is the future. And the real question is why, when you have examples like that out there, hasn't it spread? Because we still have a third-party system. You still have HR departments that use one broker, and instead of what you have in retirements, where you have a whole plethora of choices, like in the federal government, you should have, right now, if you work for the feds, in many cases, you get to choose from 10 or 15 or 20 health insurance plans. That's going to come to the private sector. So in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, it's going to be the free market that does it, not the government.
So,
and soon you're going to, and in terms of Social Security, we still have time where younger people can have a portion of their money go into their own personal accounts.
401k plan.
401k, and the thing is on growth rates, the feds assume we're going to grow at 1.8. I think we can get to 3 or 3.5, and when you do that, that gives you a lot of time to solve a lot of problems. Look at those assumptions on growth rates. And also I think that's going to bring about, strange as it may sound today, a return to a gold-based dollar. Just one little factoid, before we went off the gold standard, our average growth rate for almost 200 years was 3.5%. Since then, it's been about a 1% less. Compounded over time, median individual income now is 63,000, households higher. But if we'd had our normal growth rates over 50 years, that number would not be 60, it would be in the 90s. We've lost 50% of real income because of unstable money. That's going to change.
So, Peter, that just goes to prove there is hope.
Well, first of all, the government has destroyed the free market in healthcare by allowing employers to pay health insurance tax-free to their employees. And so that's when people stop buying their own health insurance and getting it for free from their employers.
But not anymore. As he's saying, you're paying more and more.
Yeah, that's what we need.
For the tax deductibles and so forth.
Right. The government, though, is the one that screwed it up. But as far as Social Security, there is no way to just let the young people off the hook. Because the way a Ponzi scheme works is those young people have to keep paying in so that the older people like Mark and I could get, and you could get Social Security. So if you let the younger people take some of their Social Security money and invest it, that's just bigger deficit to fund the current retirees. The only solution to Social Security is to cut the benefits for people who are currently receiving Social Security.
And they are going to do that, raise the age.
Well, they should have, look, they should eliminate it completely. They need to means test it. If you have a certain amount of assets, if you have a certain amount of income, you just can't get any money because there's no money there. They already spend more than they collect in Social Security taxes right now. And the so-called trust funds are nothing more than a stack of the government's own IOUs, which it now has to sell. But if they don't cut Social Security, it's not like the Social Security recipients aren't going to get hit. They're going to get hit with inflation. And the way it's going now, everybody is going to get wiped out of Social Security. If you take a more surgical approach and actually cut benefits for some, then the people that really need the money might still get some. But if you just print a bunch of money, then everybody gets wiped out equally, the people who need it and the people who don't. But nobody has the political will. Donald Trump wouldn't even talk about cutting Social Security or Medicare. So it's not going to happen until there is a crisis, meaning that the Social Security payments don't buy anything. That's when it's gonna hit the fan.
Don, what do you say to that?
Peter makes good points. I think there's two modest but real signs of progress. One is because Biden had such a horrible inflation policy, but the inflation only hit 8% at its height, but there were such political consequences from that. Remember, we hadn't had real inflation for almost 50 years. So
say that again?
We hadn't had real inflation before Biden for almost 50 years.
Because it was in the stock market.
Yeah, I understand that, but in terms of prices the consumer paid.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we've had inflation since World War II, permanent rising inflation.
8%, I'm talking about Biden level inflation. We had not had Biden level inflation.
1970s? You don't remember the 70s?
I said 50 years.
Well, I guess you're right. Seems like just yesterday.
How much time why do I have to argue with the moderator?
Am I that old?
Look, and of course there was also COVID. Look, so my point is, politicians now know there's a political reaction to inflation. It cost the Democrats the House in 2022. It cost the Democrats the Senate and the White House in 2024. So Peter's right. I mean, obviously inflation is one way to take care of Social Security benefits you can't pay for. That, I think politically they realize that has consequences now that they don't want to have. So Donald Trump is the other factor here. Of course Trump doesn't want to cut entitlements. Of course Trump wants to kick the can down the road. All of that is true. On the other hand, Donald Trump is a very unusual person because he is the recipient of what some of his advisors well know historically of the mad bomber theory. In 1972, when Richard Nixon was negotiating the end of the Vietnam War with Henry Kissinger, they agreed, Kissinger and Nixon, to send Kissinger to the Paris peace talks and have Kissinger tell the North Vietnamese, I am sorry, I have tried to talk to my president, but he has gone crazy. He wants to bomb you. He knows the addresses of where everyone you live is. And this is before the targeting of drones that the Israelis just did so well in Tehran. And I'm sorry, I can no longer contain this man. You must negotiate with us, seriously. And they did. Obviously, they broke the agreement later on. The South Vietnamese were the victims of that. But Trump is the new mad bomber. I mean, look at what's just happened. While the Israelis were bombing Tehran, Trump was having the White House picnic, I think privately because he wanted to celebrate. So Trump is capable, unlike most previous US leaders who were bland bureaucrats or party apparatchiks or simply brain dead. I can't possibly think of a recent president who would fit that category. And Trump is a different character. He's unpredictable. Because he's unpredictable, you could get some very interesting political results, including a Congress that might just do the right thing, if for no other reason than Donald Trump at some point, right after the next midterm elections, will realize he's not running for president again, and maybe something can happen. I'm not going to make a bet on it, but I think that Trump is a factor we don't
know. Peter, before you say anything, we need time for the audience to ask questions, right, Joanne?
Yeah, and Jimmy, were you about to say something?
and have Jimmy say something. Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I just want to add that, like, I do think it's too late. Like, if you had said 10 years ago that we'd have a $2 trillion deficit before the crash, that's the state we'd be in, you know, everybody would be like, oh, clearly we're in a crisis. And the fact that interest on the debt is more than what we're spending on the military, even if Social Security wasn't going up, we'd still be screwed. Like, we can't sustain these deficits. And everybody keeps talking about what Trump might do, but he had his first term where he called for lower interest rates, and we've seen what he's done so far. And even with everything Elon Musk tried to do to cut spending, the Republicans just passed spending increases anyway. So I don't see any hope. And then when you add on top of that the tariffs, like, I grew up as a Republican. I'm more of a libertarian now, I'll admit, but like, come on, like, we were free trade Republicans not that long ago, and now everybody's making excuses about all these tariffs, when in reality it's going to destroy our economy and make us lose world reserve currency status fast.
Well,
The tariffs are going to fall within.
On the tariffs, the Supreme Court's going to come to the rescue.
Yes.
They're going to throw them out, especially this 10% thing. And in terms of health care, you ask, and this is going to come up shortly, family policy is now over $20,000 a year, at least. You go to a typical worker and say, for $5,000 you can get a true catastrophic coverage above a certain level, and you get to keep the $15,000. How many would keep the current system they have today? That's going to become more and more of a choice.
That's the type of insurance that Americans had before the government got involved and screwed it up. But as far as
short, Peter, keep it short.
If Donald Trump was going to do the right thing, he'd be doing it right now. While he has the Congress, he has the House, he has the Senate, he should be threatening to veto that big, beautiful bill. But instead, he's the one that's ramming it through Congress. And anyone who stands up, whether it's a Thomas Massey or Rand Paul, and tries to call out the truth about that bill, they get, crucified. He calls them a traitor. He says you're a grandstander. We got to get you kicked out of the Republican Party because you actually want to cut government spending. Because the big, beautiful bill takes the deficit problem that they just inherited and makes it worse. It increases spending. It cuts taxes. And all the so-called spending cuts to Medicaid don't even kick in for 5 years. And these guys know damn well.
That's actually been taken over. That's actually changed in the negotiations.
Oh,
Peter, everything you've just said is true except for one thing.
What?
You don't pass this bill, every one person in this room is going to see their taxes go up between $3,000 and $7,000 a year. That's not going to help the economy either.
If we do pass the bill, then everybody's
let me interrupt.
There's only one thing worse than passing this bill.
One
that's
of the
not
things
passing it.
about the bill that's really important.
Gold stocks. This bill's going to make me a fortune.
Cut off their mic, please. One of the things that you're completely ignoring about this bill is there's a lot of good stuff in this bill too, and that's typical of every omnibus bill. There's always good things and bad things, and you have to weigh the balance. The problem, Peter, is you never weigh the balance. You only look at the negative.
But that's
look
how
at
we got
both
to a
sides.
37.
All right, honey,
Start
I'm
with a
next.
question over here.
I have a question. I think it's a good.
Well, I hope it's a good one. I have some cash in the bank because I just sold the house in Santa Barbara, and I have another one where I could live sustainable. So I have a big Home Depot bill that I want to buy generators and propane tanks and things to prepare to live sustainable. Or I could keep my cash in the bank. Which would you do? Also, 2 years ago, I bought a bunch of silver and it hasn't gone up very much. Do you expect silver? So I asked 2 questions. Thank you.
Well, the silver coins are now costing $40 or more. The gold, silver is starting to really move again. Gold's been a better investment over the last 20 years, but silver's also starting to move up. They don't pay interest. I like dividend-paying stocks. For those of you who are familiar with my newsletter, check that out because there's some really good winners that have consistently made money.
Mark, so in 2001 you could buy silver for less than $5 an ounce. So it's now $36. So it's not like it hasn't gone up.
Right, but it's gone up and then down again. It's hit $50 twice and then moved back down. So it is very volatile.
Yeah, gold's been better because the central banks haven't been buying silver. They've been buying gold. But I think when the public wakes up, they're going to buy silver more than gold.
I think the point is, and this is really important, folks, there's always ways to protect yourself. But remember, in a bear market, the winner is he who loses the least.
But my advice on your cash in the bank is I think that there's no way to win with money in the bank. Either your bank is going to fail, which is not an impossibility, and there won't be a bailout, or your bank will be bailed out with inflation, but the banks are paying no interest, and inflation is going to erode away the value of that cash. So unfortunately, you shouldn't save your money in the bank, which is, bad for the country that we don't have savings, but you're going to be punished if you save. So you need to find ways to escape the inflation tax, which is the tax. So if they pass the big, beautiful bill, inflation is going to be much higher, and that's a tax. The government's going to print the money that it doesn't collect in taxes, and it's going to destroy the value of your bank deposits. So you have to invest, and I have a workshop tomorrow where I'm going to be talking about how you can invest the cash that you take out of the bank.
And by the way, you mentioned several things like protecting yourself with fuel, because energy shortages is going to be a problem. You're not going to be able to get on the internet, and you better have some preparation if we're back to a survival type of situation in these kinds of crises. Power outages is going to be something we have a problem with our grid. There's a lot of problems with our infrastructure, so we're moving back to an era where we need to stock up on things that we need. And you don't want to go overboard, but I do think it's something to consider.
We were actually dealing with that backstage all day yesterday. I hope you guys didn't realize it, but we were really close to having to completely shut down because the power outages, and our backstage crew were working like crazy to keep things going. We had to turn off the sauna machines in the exhibit hall in order to keep the power going. But that's going to become more and more usual. So I think that was a very important question.
But before we do another question, I do want to mention the one thing that didn't come up, and obviously the most important thing you should invest in if there's going to be a financial crisis is economics documentaries about financial crises. So if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I have a business plan.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you all.
Steve Forbes, Peter Schiff, John Kahn, together again, and especially Jimmy Morrison for a wonderful film, and my husband, Mark Skousen.
You can see our films at thefallof2008.com and the rest of our content at letusdisagree.com. Upcoming, we have Gary Johnson and Grant Williams, so I hope you'll stick around.
All this has happened before, and it will all happen again.
The reality is we have gone from a stock market bubble, now we have a housing bubble, and when it breaks, whatever causes it to pop, then a lot of people are going to find out, oh my God, not only are my stocks down, my house is down too, and now what do I do?
Charlie, this was the day we were afraid to wake up to, the bankruptcy of one major Wall Street investment bank, the shotgun wedding of another.
Can't be distracted. What's going on with the war? What's wrong with the economy? Stop worrying about that.
They're not only doing the wrong thing, they're doing exactly the opposite of the right thing.
We got into our mess by spending too much money, running up too much debt, and printing too much money, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Which, by the way, would seem how we got into this state of affairs in the first place.
You have to work for money, kids.
No, you don't. It comes from the machine in the wall. I've seen it. Yeah, you just have to push buttons.
Take a greater risk on these mortgages, yes. To give families mortgages who they would not have given otherwise, yes.
It means we use the mighty muscle of the federal government in combination with state and local governments to encourage owning your own home. That's what that means.
I ask all of you just one more time to look at that chart. And I wish I had a lot of other charts to show you that would reinforce that.
You can't buy a house before you have a job.
You get a job, you save for a down payment, then you buy the house.
A lot of people are going to find out, oh my God, not only is my stocks down, my house is down too, and now what do I do?
Jim Rogers knew these bubbles were going to burst, but I didn't. Neither did filmmaker Jimmy Morrison, who started a house painting business less than a month after home prices peaked. His timing couldn't have been worse. But we don't have to make those mistakes again. There are people out there who called it, and next time, maybe we can too.
We've got a growing economy, jobs, incomes.
We've got very low mortgage rates.
Housing is going to be a disaster in the next 5 years. You sell housing stocks and you sell Ben Bernanke.
One myth that's out there is that what we're doing is printing money. We're not printing money.
These days, they don't need a printing press. All they do is they need a computer keyboard.
So we're not a free market then. There is an invisible, there's a benevolent hand that touches us. Absolutely.
These people in the government apparently don't learn anything at all.
They broke it, and they're trying to fix it by doing more of what broke it in the first place.
The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that.
What? Of course it could happen again, and it's happened before.
Raw materials were allocated between essential and non-essential business.
I hope they don't lose confidence in their government. I can see why there's skepticism, but it's the only government we got.